Let your imagination fly freely in the great outdoors. You can soar through the air on the wings of an eagle, leap in the ocean like a dolphin, stretch your arms as the branches of a tree in the breeze, feel birds and butterflies alight on your shoulders. Fall soft and silent as the snow, then melt into the welcoming earth. Our preparatory hymn is number 134, Our World is One World. Stand as you are willing and able. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kathryn Sheffield. She's graced this podium many times in the past, always bringing new insights into how myth affects our lives. Today, coming on the heels of our 44th Earth Day, she will speak to us about eco-myths and our relationship to nature. Welcome back, Kathy.
Okay, so I'm going to start with some of nature's great. Good morning.
Good morning.
When I was called to speak today and given this date, they said, well, what would you like to talk about? And I went over things I had talked about in the past, and I thought, well, April is Earth Day, and we will have just passed Earth Day. Let's talk about Earth Day. And at the time I thought, well, okay, that's going to be a fairly straightforward presentation. I'll think about myths about the Earth. But then, of course, we had Newtown and the Boston Marathon bombing, and things have changed. The zeitgeist has changed. And I started to think, well, April is also Poetry Month. And when I need healing, to me, poetry and prayer are one and the same thing. They spring from the same place. So I thought I would kind of interweave the two themes and give you sort of my meditation and weave in some facts. And whenever I'm allowed to speak here, I always think, geez, I hope I have something insightful to say. Because, as always, the prayers and the meditations and the hymns that we've sung are so deep that I kind of think I don't really have much to add to that. But when I started thinking about it, and the reason I suggested Earth Day was that I just went back last October to my 40th high school reunion. And I grew up in Long Island. And the last day before we left, it was a beautiful Indian summer with leaf colors I haven't seen since I've been out here in the desert. And we decided to go back to my high school. And we walked to the east lawn, and there, shading the east side of the high school, was a row of about 10 beautiful trees, all in yellow, gold, rust, different colors. And I remembered that 42 years before, I had helped to plant those trees. Some of our far-sighted teachers, Mr. Ostrander, who was my English teacher, Mr. Mouse, my earth science teacher, had heard about the first Earth Day and had gotten permission and used their own money to buy the trees, brought their own tools. And we took our English and science periods and went outside and planted those trees. And didn't think much about them after that, really. But going back, I could see that for many decades now, because of the wear underneath, students have enjoyed sitting under those trees. And certainly birds have enjoyed it. And maybe it's even helped reduce the carbon footprint, soaking up a little carbon and shading the east side of the school so they don't need quite as much air conditioning. And I thought, sometimes the smallest things we do have lasting impact. We used to say, think globally, act locally. And that is true for time, too. Sometimes just a moment's thing to do has lasting impact. So I was kind of amazed by that. And after my husband and I stood and looked at the trees, and I bored him with the story that I just bored you with, we went to one of my favorite places on earth, which is many people's favorite place on Long Island, Jones Beach. My husband and I had always gone every October to Jones Beach, where they would plant chrysanthemums. And we would go and look at the chrysanthemums and then walk the quarter mile of beach, it's quite a long beach, out to the ocean and collect some last shells and say goodbye to the summer season and the beach season. So we decided to do that again. And we did. And we walked out there, and I kicked off my shoes and rolled up my pants and went wading, expecting to be frozen, because usually the ocean's pretty cold by then. And instead, felt water that was as warm as August, which is as warm as the beach ever gets on Long Island. And as I gathered some shells and took some pictures, I said to my husband, "This is a hurricane highway. Anybody who doesn't believe global warming ought to come and take a wade here today." And we flew home, and less than a week later, Hurricane Sandy hit. And I treasure those shells, which sit in a bowl on my coffee table, because that beach is now open ocean. So I thought, yeah, Earth Day, things have changed. So I thought I would start with just some of the facts. Where did Earth Day come from, anyway? I didn't know back in 1970. Many of us, I guess, I won't point out names or point out who remember the first Earth Day. And the whole Earth consciousness really kind of started in 1962 with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. People started worrying about DDT and the chemicals we were adding. And by 1969, we had a massive oil spill in Santa Barbara, California, and the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland had caught fire. So people could no longer ignore that we were having a deleterious effect on our environment. Senator Gaylord Nelson, a Democrat of Wisconsin, had been very impressed by the collective anti-war activism on America's college campuses, which was also raging at this time. And he thought, what if we could harness the energy of the young people for the environment? And so he decided to try to do that. He joined with Congressman Pete McCloskey to imitate what we used to have, and again, some of you may remember teach-ins about the Vietnam War. He said, let's have a teach-in on the environment. And they recruited Dennis Hayes, who was a political college organizer of these anti-Vietnam teach-ins, and said, how are we going to do this? And originally they thought, let's do it on the spring equinox. That's a really good environmental time. The problem was, A, that's spring break for many colleges. You're not going to get a big turnout. And number two, it's cold in most of America's areas. And again, it's not good for prolonged sitting outdoors. So they shifted it to April 22nd, and I could not find for the life of me why that date. I don't know why. But that's why we have Earth Day on April 22nd. And the first teach-in was absolutely a smash success beyond what they had expected. And so they declared that the first Earth Day would be April 22nd, 1970. and that's the day on which I planted those trees, and I'm sure you all remember did something. All right? That first Earth Day did start a movement, and it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency under Richard Nixon, surprise, and the passage of the Clean Air, the Clean Water, and the Endangered Species Act by bipartisan votes in Congress. Bipartisan, surprise. What is that word, right? Every year since then, we have had an Earth Day, and it has been growing. In 1990, the 20th anniversary, the same Dennis Hayes who organized the first was asked to organize a worldwide Earth Day, because we now had at least a nascent form of sort of an internet and international communication. He did. And in 1990, 200 million people in 141 countries participated. And this has hugely increased the amount of recycling around the world and has actually had a measurable impact on the condition of our environment. In 1992, we had the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, a mixed success but a good precedent. And in 1995, Bill Clinton awarded Senator Gaylord Nelson the Presidential Medal of Freedom for starting Earth Day and raising our consciousness. At the beginning of this millennium, Dennis Hayes used the now vigorous internet to organize a record 5,000 environmental groups in 184 countries around the need to find clean energy, the big search that is going to consume this century in one way or another. 2010 was the 40th anniversary. Now, in that intervening decade, 2000, 2010, things began to stall a little bit. Not so much worldwide, but certainly here in the United States. When we say things like bipartisan, it's a historical word now, isn't it? We've had divisions among environmental groups themselves as to how to proceed and which environmental cause should take precedence and how we should pool or not pool our efforts. And then we have had a rising tide of opposition in this country from big oil, advertising and co-opting and purchasing elections, and right-wing climate change deniers who just say, well, let's stall this whole argument right at the facts. Let's insist it's not happening. Right? But worldwide, activism has increased, widening the chasm between what's happening here and what's happening elsewhere. So as I thought of this, I thought, okay, what can I bring to this? Do I have any insights? And I thought, well, of course, myth, right? It's my thing. But poetry and language is also my thing. I'm a linguist by training. So I thought I would kind of just trace for you some of the views of nature and some of the underlying concepts and where we might be getting hung up and where mythologically we might need to go. And I brought some poems to intersperse with this because I think they exemplify what I'm saying. So if we go back, the most ancient representations we have of nature are things like the cave paintings. It's obvious that our earliest ancestors had great respect and reverence because they rendered beautiful, realistic portraits of some species that are now extinct, like the aurochs and early ibexes and gazelles. And it's also obvious from looking at those early petroglyphs and paintings that the range of things like hippos and lions and giraffes were far different than they are today. That the earth has changed, and certainly those early changes were not due to our efforts solely. The earth is always changing. Right? What seems to come through from these earliest paintings and these earliest times, and from today's primal peoples who live very close to their environment, is that all of the earth is sacred, humans included. Everything one does is connected, very much like some of the words we spoke this morning. There is no supernatural, it's all here. But what we would call supernatural is here in the environment. So in many of these societies, having beings speak to you that we scientifically would say can't speak, like rocks or thunder, is perfectly okay. It's a different form of nature, a sacralized nature. But that's not the nature we lived with, and that's not the nature the West has given us as our heritage. The earliest creation myths seem to split, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, somewhere in the nation of Iran. East of Iran, we get a concept of dualism, a yin-yang complementarity. Everything is either yin or yang, but both are necessary. And the highest wisdom is to be able to transcend that duality and see that it's all part of one thing. A Zen scripture says, nothing in nature can be evil. So the idea of good and evil is not mapped onto this world. It's something that is recognized as a concept in the human mind, and one that is in error, one that we need to transcend. We don't ally ourselves solely with good and fight evil in Eastern mythology. We transcend it and see that what is evil to one is good or necessary to another, and that all is part of one. In the West, we tended to do a rather different division. We tended to divide into a supernatural world ruled by a god or gods and various other supernatural beings, and a natural or profane nature, the passive creation of that god, and trapped in the middle, mankind, humankind, having something of the angels and something of the beasts. And there is an eternal battle given to us by Iran called Persian dualism between good and evil, God and Satan. And we are in constant battle. And as Campbell quoted one of my favorite teachers, Daisetsu T. Suzuki, who was one of the first popularizers of Zen Buddhism in the West, at a conference Campbell attended, he quoted Suzuki as saying, God against man, man against God, God against nature, nature against God, nature against man, man against nature. Very funny religion. This evolved in the West into a theory called the Great Chain of Being, with God at the top and various archangels, angels, cherubim, seraphim, etc., coming down to humans, and then animals of various kinds, and then plants, and then inanimate objects. And this persists in our society. We still tend to believe in this, in some sense. So we have sort of two strains that give us the Western view of nature, and one of them is the biblical. And in thinking about this, I reviewed, there are 4 ramifications that are fairly well known in the literature, but I kind of teased out a 5th that I haven't found that I wanted to share with you. The 4 that you may be familiar with is, according to our biblical traditions, the supernatural, God, is privileged over the natural. God is the most important thing. We privilege, therefore, in the great chain of being, humans over nature. Right? Well, we don't say necessarily humankind, although we may here, but that sort of assumes man over nature. And therefore, there's a patriarchy built into this, male over female, which is the 3rd one. And because males have been privileged over females and therefore closer to God, and God exists in the realm of thought, we have tended in the West to privilege thinking over feeling. We've identified feeling and emotionality with females, females with nature, and therefore somehow inferior to rational thought. Okay, so that's what I got from the literature. And then I started to think, how does this apply to environmentalism? Well, one of the things that exists only in thought is the idea of eternity, the unchanging, the forever. That is not our experience here on earth. Everything changes. We change, and everything around us changes. Eternity exists only up here, in this privileged thinking area. And I'm going to come back to that because I think it is a stumbling block for us right now. So let me take another sip of water here, excuse me. So as an example of how the Bible uses nature, the Bible tends to use nature as a source metaphor, as the concrete form that represents the superior abstractness of God. And we're probably all familiar with the 23rd Psalm. It's one of the most well-known. Listen to it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. And then at the end, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now we may think of this as praise of nature, but when you think of it, this is not nature. This is domesticated nature. The Lord is a shepherd, leading us into places already known, places already tamed. And our ambition here is to dwell in the house of the Lord. This is in some ways a rejection of absolute wildness. And the term wilderness itself often has a frightening connotation for Westerners. It's interesting to note that of all the hundreds of Native American languages, not one of them has the word wilderness in it. Very different concept. I also found in Psalm 72 a reference to God. He shall come down like rain upon mown grass. Again, mown grass. They were mowing lawns even back then, or at least their farms. All the references of nature, there's not a lot of nature without supernatural or human intervention and taming in the Bible. This seems to be one of our strands of inheritance. We get a very different Western inheritance from the classical tradition of Greece and Rome. We still have a great chain of being, with the gods at the top and demigods and all types of beings, that results in a sort of animism, a population of nature with spirits that was called the numinous, after the Roman numens, or local spirits. But again, it's not nature itself. It's not a tree that's sacred. It's sacred if a spirit lives in it. It's not the spring or the grove that's sacred. It is sacred to Diana or another goddess. That's why it's sacred. There is still this Western dichotomy present in there. Right? And if you think of some of the myths of Narcissus, he's turned into a flower, or Callista turned into the Big Dipper. These things are meant to be signs pointing to the ultimate reality that Plato talks about, the reality of ideal forms that lives up here. So very much in the West, we have inherited from two strands this sort of pseudo-rejection of nature, this artificial separation of ourselves from nature. Now, as this moves through time in the West, I'm going to kind of skip over the Middle Ages, because that great chain of being basically obtains throughout that period. But as we enter the Renaissance and then the scientific revolution, we come upon new theories. The overarching name for this is utilitarianism. The idea that things are good, not because God says they're good, but because they're useful to humans. That which is useful is good. That which is not useful is not good. Right? It has its roots in the great chain of being, the biblical charter of man over nature. Right? But it also has its roots in the classical strand of humanism, which said, as far back as ancient Greece, man is the measure of all things. We have certainly adopted that vision in our secular lives here in the West. It has led to an idea that nature's only value is its value to us. And we'll see how that comes into modern ecological argument in a second. In the 17th century, we have the scientific revolution, which begins to reject the whole notion of the supernatural world. Reductionism looks only at this physical existence. And we get things like nature is a machine. And it's part of the foundation of our country. If you look at, we are endowed by our creator. They were willing to assume a creator, but a creator like a maker of a watch, who set the wheels in motion, and we're now on our own. Right? Sort of a deist viewpoint. Nature as a soulless machine reduces nature from what Martin Buber would call a thou to an it. And we can do whatever we like to its. And some of the most egregious things happened in this century, things like vivisection of animals. Oh, don't listen to their screams. They can't feel anything. They're just machines. Right? Horrific. Horrific. This also coincides with various forms of causality with the rise of capitalism, which reduces nature to a commodity, which puts a price on everything. The value is now determined by monetary value. So on the one side of our current views of nature is, what's it worth? Meaning, what can we do with it? What's it doing for us? And can we put a price on it? All right? Okay. Now, a rejection of this came in the 18th century with the Romantic movement, which flipped it on its head Hegel's dialectic says that's bound to happen. So I thought the first poem I would share with you is the poem that actually founded the Romantic movement, William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. So listen to the poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. And I'll skip to the end. And oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Now this would seem to be a salvation. Nature is extolled. In fact, instead of making nature the source of the metaphor for God or man, now he subordinates himself to the cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud. He is the cloud. The cloud is not him. The cloud is not God. Oh, this looks like a wonderful thing, doesn't it? He uses holy words like a host of golden daffodils, making them sound like angels. So in this romantic view, nature becomes the antidote to all that went before. Nature becomes our salvation. But what nature? It's the nature recalled in the mind on the couch, not the nature as directly experienced. And in my research, I found a little funny item here. I was wondering when I read the poem, I thought, what daffodils was he looking at? I didn't think they were native to England. It turns out there is a species of daffodil, about 6 inches high, very pale yellow, that is native to the Ulrich area of the Lake District of England, where Wordsworth wrote and where he was walking. So those were the daffodils he saw. Currently in England, there is a movement to save the Wordsworthian daffodil, because the daffodils we're more familiar with, which are about a foot tall and bright yellow, have been planted in British gardens and are beginning to cross-pollinate, and because they are hardier, they are beginning to drive out the Wordsworthian daffodil. Okay? And so there is this movement. People are digging them up and moving them out and trying to figure out how to preserve this. And I thought, aha, there's that fifth realization. They're trying to hold nature steady. Eternity. And it's coming out of romanticism, not out of anything that came before. It's a romanticized view of nature as we want it to be. Benign nature, glorious nature, we don't want it to change. That's as problematic as the utilitarian view, it seems. Because we can't stop change. Right? We just can't. And I found a wonderful little poem by Emily Dickinson that I think sums up this view. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few, which struck me because bees are now becoming few with hive collapse. But in the romantic imagination, it's enough to recall the bee. You can make a whole prairie up here. Problem is, while you're doing that, we're losing the prairie out there. So the problem in the recent past, okay, we are now paralyzed in this argument, okay, with conflict and paralysis. Whenever we hear our environmental arguments, we get one side that says, well, what good is it? We have to justify not selling logging and oil rights in our national parks on the grounds of we're preserving recreational space for people. That's a utilitarian argument. Well, what if we're not? How then do we defend the pipelines in northern Alaska? No one goes up there to recreate. Right? So then we get the romantic argument. Think of the moose. Think of the elk. We should not change a thing. Nature should be held steady for them. They have as much right as we do. This argument, too, ultimately fails because we want to keep something steady and static that is not. So I thought, wow, I'm pretty depressed at this point. Where do we go from this? Well, when I first planted those trees, I held the romantic view. We were out there thinking of nature's beneficent. We were talking to our tree. We were naming our tree. We smiled at our tree. We personified it. We were Wordsworthian in the best sense of the word. And we thought, this is all we have to do. right? Go back to the land, live as we did, make it unchanging. Well, we now know better after 40-some years that can't happen. And we need new arguments. Well, in the interim, these 40-some years, we started to see nature as a system. Not so much save the whale, save the spotted owl, but save it all. The whale is indicative of the health of the ocean. The spotted owl is indicative of the health of the forest. We need those things to live. And the question now becomes a qualified question. How much of those things do we need? Under what circumstances? How much can we save? How can we make ourselves come into accord not with an unchanging nature, but with the change? How do we tease apart in this sixth great extinction on our planet, which we seem to be in, how much of it is caused by us, and how much of it we have to redress? These are very complex issues. But there have been some recent contributions and discoveries. Let me name a few. In the beginning of the 20th century, the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty came up with the idea that the very thoughts that we have privileged so much in the West, are actually a product of bodily functions. And we all know this. I like to think of the line in Dickens' Christmas Carol when he confronts Morley's ghost, and he said, "We all know our senses play tricks. You could be a bit of undigested beef." Right? Well, that was basically what Merleau-Ponty was saying. But since then, Francesco Varela and Antonio Damasio have actually gone into the scientific laboratory and documented how we have not only a brain here, but we have a secondary brain in the gut. When we talk about a gut feeling, it's not just a metaphor. We physically do have brain cells throughout us. And it's been recently discovered, as a mother, this troubles me greatly, that mothers and children exchange cells during gestation. And mothers may retain cells of their fetuses in their bodies for the rest of their lives, and children may retain cells from their mothers. We're not even a total physical cell. All right. Well, in my field of linguistics, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson have spent their careers looking at how we think. We think in metaphor, just like poets, just like mystics. And metaphors always need a concrete subject to compare to that abstract. And they have explored how these metaphors that we use, nature as salvation, nature as Mother Nature, how they have repercussions in the way we are willing to treat nature and the ways we are willing not to treat nature. And those of you who watch Moyers and Company on PBS may have seen last week Sandra Steingraber, who is an activist about getting some of the toxic chemicals out of our environment, because she has documented that some chemicals that are in our plastics and in our foods actually cross the blood-brain barrier and become part of our brain cells and are affecting how we are able to think. Talk about the interconnection of humanity and nature. We really are nature, and it's recursive. The stuff we put into nature comes back and becomes us. And that, of course, reminds me of Pogo. We have met the enemy and they are us. I always think in terms of humor. But we now have the Gaia hypothesis. Maybe this whole Earth is one giant organism. Or maybe we're one cell in an even more giant organism of a solar system, a galaxy, a universe, a multiverse. We don't know. We don't know. What we can see, that we know we affect, but what can't we see that we're affecting? The law of unintended consequences, the dark matter, the dark energy. We don't know. But we are now seeing nature as a system or as a web, with everything we do affecting everything else, including the self that then continues to affect. We affect and are affected, and we're back to Martin Buber's nature as thou. We are back to the original mythic vision that's re-arising, that this is one living thing and we are a part of it, and there is no it to exploit. Right? So I thought I would end with a couple of poems that I thought sort of embodied this in a way. Right? First is by Howard Nemeroff, called Blue Swallows, and it's the last stanza of the poem. Oh, swallows, swallows, poems are not the point. Finding again the world, that is the point, where loveliness adorns intelligible things, because the mind's eye lit the sun. And I would add, the sun also lights the mind's eye. And another, called Fifth Psalm by Mark Jarman. Lord of dimensions and the dimensionless, waves and particle, all and none, who lets us measure the wounded atom we have split, who let us doubt all measurement. When in this world we betray you, let us be faithful in another. But there, the idea is maybe this is the other. We must be faithful at all times. And then finally, a longer poem, which I just love because it weaves back on itself the same way nature seems to, by Kathleen Rain, called The Spell of Creation. Within the flower there lies a seed. Within the seed there springs a tree. Within the tree there spreads a wood. In the wood there burns a fire, and in the fire there melts a stone. Within the stone a ring of iron. Within the ring there lies an O. Within the O there looks an eye. In the eye there swims a sea. And in the sea reflected sky, and in the sky there shines the sun. Within the sun a bird of gold. Within the bird there beats a heart, and from the heart there flows a song, and in the song there sings a word. In the word there speaks a word of joy, a world of grief. From joy and grief there springs my love. O love, my love, there springs a world, and on the world there shines a sun, and in the sun there burns a fire. Within the fire consumes my heart, and in my heart there beats a bird, and in the bird there wakes an eye. Within the eye, earth, sea, and sky, earth, sky, and sea within an O, like the seed within the flower.
Thank you, Dr. Sheffield. Please stand as you are willing and able. Join in the singing of our closing hymn, number 175, We Celebrate the Web of Love. Please join me in the reading of our West Valley UU Church's mission statement. It's in your order of service. This church provides a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration for our lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. We will close with an adaptation from the Gaelic runes. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace with the shining stars to you. Deep peace of infinite peace to you. Let us go now in that peace, continue our celebration and sharing of food and fellowship. Thank you.